evening, good people. How lovely to see you all again. Welcome to the Neil Oliver Show on GB News TV, online and on the radio box. This evening, my show will be looking at the effects of the lockdowns. We'll be discussing whether what happened in 2020 and thereafter is still having an impact today. My first guest will be Dr. Claire Craig, and we'll be talking together about how bringing the country to a standstill had and still is having an effect on children and young people. I'll be joined after that by former lawyer Molly Kingsley, who in 2020 was one of the founder members of the group Us for Them, which stood up for children's interests during the pandemic. And then former leader of the National Education Union, Kevin Courtney, who'll talk with me about why schools had no choice but to shut their doors when they did. All of that, plus plenty of discussion with my panellist, political commentator and friend, Ralph Schulhammer. We tell ourselves that children are our most precious resource and treasure. We sing songs about it. I believe that children are our future and all that jazz. Let's have a look at the recent reality of life and death of children around the world, shall we? According to the Gaza Health Ministry, more than 12,300 children have been killed in that open-air prison since October last year. The children of the generation that went through the fires of hell and said never again are witnessing 21st century children consumed by other flames. Plausible genocide, the International Court of Justice calls it. If taken at face value, it would mean more children died in Gaza between October last year and February this year than the combined number of all that died in all conflict around the world in the 4 years from 2019 to 2022. For those who dismiss numbers presented by the Gaza Health Ministry as unreliable, even fictional, the Save the Children charity estimates the total of dead children in Gaza in the 100 days from October to the end of January, that's already 6 weeks out of date, at 10,000. Whichever figures you believe, it seems reasonable to accept we're confronted by a lot of dead children and babies piling up in the few square miles of Gaza. There's all manner of footage, again, much of it roundly dismissed as fake in some way, of little corpses pulled from piles of rubble and wrapped in brightly coloured blankets for transport to God knows where. Maybe God does know. Hopefully God cares as well, because evidently not enough of the right people do. Not enough to make it stop. Children are our future, we sing. So what about all those children with no futures at all? Last month, UNICEF estimated at least 17,000 Gazan children had been orphaned by that war, or at least separated from all family and therefore left alone. 17,000 stories of heartbreak and grief. In a separate report for UNICEF, the plight of the children of Ukraine was laid bare. 2 years of chaos, destruction and loss, separation from families, disrupted schooling, disrupted healthcare, reports of a mental health crisis and a learning crisis. Many children have fled the chaos alone, exposing them to abuse of every kind. Human trafficking on an industrial scale, children robbed of childhood, scars visible and invisible. Human traffickers, child traffickers, dark tales abound of more of the same, harvesting a bumper crop of orphans in Gaza too. It seems to me that present evidence makes plain that far from irreplaceable treasures, too many children are treated as disposable. Closer to home, we have altogether different damage to contemplate. All parents hear and share anecdotal evidence of harms caused to children during the COVID years. In lockdown, the response to the neighbourly question, "How are you all doing?" was met first with a cheery, "Fine." Time spent digging deeper, however, invariably revealed struggles, anxieties, real concerns about youngsters. We must now conclude that as a society, we will be dealing with the poisonous consequences of lockdown for years to come, if not forever. A consensus on the number of so-called ghost children, those who fell off the radar of schools and social services during the COVID debacle and haven't been heard of since, is hard to come by, but tens of thousands is certain, and the think tank Centre for Social Justice says 100,000. The CSJ tries to keep a spotlight on the poorest and most disadvantaged in society. And as early as 2021, they were warning, quote, "COVID-19 has wreaked havoc in our schools. Young people's life chances have been laid waste by successive school shutdowns and interruptions to their learning. The damage caused by lockdowns could not be clearer than in the case of school attendance. The pandemic has given rise to a generation of ghost children. If we're not careful, we're creating an Oliver Twist generation of children exposed to significant safeguarding hazards," end quote. Over the years here at GB News, I've spoken specifically about children. My primary motivation for speaking out at all, in any context, from the beginning, 3 or 4 years ago, was as a parent, fearing for my own children, what lockdown and the rest of the madness would do to them, how it would affect their futures by fundamentally altering the fabric of society. When it came to the products pushed as vaccines, my number one focus was on making sure no needle touched any of my children. And so, from time to time on a Saturday night, I made children the focus of what I was talking about, including asking questions about harms caused to so many by the malignancy of the lockdown policies that kept families apart, closed schools, delayed learning to speak, compromised normal emotional and psychological development, delayed the learning of social skills, left unknowable numbers isolated in dangerous domestic circumstances. But the truth is that the viewing figures for those monologues were always conspicuously lower than those on other subjects. Maybe when it comes to children, too many people just don't want to know, just don't want to think about it. But here we are in 2024 and a world made different. All parents know that if their children were hooked on phones and the rest of the tech before lockdown, that time of enforced isolation only cranked up the addiction. We all hear the stories about spikes in the number of children self-harming with eating disorders, simply struggling with day-to-day life. Referrals for children needing mental health treatment spiked along with the rest. Last year it was reported that 1 in 5 primary and secondary age children are behind in their speech skills, their understanding of words. Charity Speech and Language UK said it was the highest number of children with speech and language challenges ever recorded. 80% of teachers said children in their classrooms were lagging behind. This is fundamental, condemning generations to underachievement, to isolation from society on account of not understanding, not being able to make themselves understood. During a recent parliamentary debate on excess deaths, Conservative MP Dr Caroline Johnson, a consultant paediatrician as well as an MP, reported that up to March 2023 there was an 8% increase in child deaths compared to the year before. She went on to say suicide and self-harm was the main cause of death for children between the ages of 10 and 17, quote, getting much worse in the 10 to 14 age group. Stop for a moment to take that in. Of course, the vast majority of MPs won't discuss excess deaths, full stop, staying away in droves from any debates on the subject. Which brings me to the subject of accountability. We can see where we are now, surrounded by children struggling, falling behind, falling through cracks in the floorboards, dying in greater numbers than before, self-harming, killing themselves. All of this has happened on our watch in a time made utterly different by official policies, with which MPs of all stripes remained in lockstep, almost without exception, giving their full-throated support. Safe and effective, that worst of all mantras, was a death sentence for uncounted numbers. Worst of all, it was never based on data of any sort, just baseless, preordained propaganda from the start. Save our NHS, 3 weeks to flatten the curve, no jab, no job, were yet more mantras, all of them contributing to the alternative reality in which we find ourselves, with children bearing so much of the brunt. Last week, the sometime catch-up czar, tasked back in 2020 with helping repair the damage done to education, talked about the circumstances that saw him resign his post and walk away in disgust, describing how government at first promised commitment and then refused to foot the bill for the necessary measures. Sir Kevin Collins said, "All these things we could have done to send a signal about childhood, but we did nothing. We gave up. It was pathetic." We must have accountability from MPs, from doctors, from scientists, from the media, from all levels of the establishment. Because if those who set and train the policies that left us where we are remain in post, then we will have learned nothing, and even worse consequences will lie ahead. All the time children were shut up at home, all the time we were told children are resilient. It was Wine Time Friday in Downing Street, a maskless free-for-all where access to the data plainly reassured those ruling our lives, restricting our lives, that there was nothing at all to fear. We know where we are. Hardly any child can report a peer that died of COVID. Plenty more have seen youngsters, often the fittest of the fit youngsters, dropping dead on the field of play for reasons that are never made plain, never discussed. Like so many of us, they've certainly known family members, neighbours, parents of friends succumbing to unexpected heart attacks and strokes. More of those who feature in the spiking figures of the excess deaths we're not supposed to notice, far less mention. A generation of our youngest, at crucial times in their education, know they were let down by teachers, by university lecturers, let down by the authorities that closed their schools and their gyms and the rest of the venues making up the fabric of their lives. That they were pressured into accepting medical interventions even when they'd had COVID and so had natural immunity from an illness that posed them no meaningful threat anyway, so they could get into pubs and nightclubs. They look on at the adults, those who wielded power over them, and find no reason to trust those so-called grown-ups ever again. It's no exaggeration whatever to say that on the altar of Save Granny, children's well-being was knowingly sacrificed, and many of them know it. I remember saying at the time that a society standing behind a shield made of its own children, that forces children to risk their lives by being injected with products that were demonstrably neither safe nor effective, and that most important of all, they never needed, is no society at all. Here's the thing. Society sought to put children's lives on hold, to shut them indoors, to sacrifice their education, to turn a blind eye to the hobbling of the natural development of the very youngest and most vulnerable. I ask again, where are we as a society? Who are we as a species if we don't put children first at all times? As parents, our gut reaction should be to nurture and care. So why do we so often look the other way while so much is inflicted on the innocent by those guilty of putting profit and ideology before the well-being of our youngest? I'm joined now by political commentator Ralph Schulhammer. Thanks for joining me, Ralph.
Thanks for having me, Neil. Always a great pleasure to be with you.
And for me. Ralph, I am in reflective mood this evening, looking back over the long period of 3-4 years now. Can I invite you to, how do you assess what happened and where we are now?
Well, I think there are a couple of things we know now. I mean, we have known even before COVID that particularly for people of an elderly age, loneliness is a major cause of death. And now we know that also for young people, loneliness has significant repercussions. I think you mentioned absolutely correctly, right? Whether it's the use of social media, whether it's screen time. But I think that's more a symptom than a cause, right? If you have no other meaningful connections, the likelihood of you being addicted to social media is significantly higher. And I kind of looked up a little bit the development of civil associations in Britain over the last 100 years. And it's in steep decline. So I think the social media age is just showing us something that was going on beneath the surface for a longer time. And what happened during COVID, and you mentioned it's wonderful in your monologue, what made it so frustrating is apparently there was this sincere belief that children don't need social contact, right? That you particularly at the most important stages of development, 15, 16, puberty, right? The first love, like the first beer in the pub with your friends, like this was taken away from that generation. That is, as some would say, this is not just a crime, this is a mistake, because as you correctly pointed out, you stunt the healthy social development of these young people. And if you look, for those of your viewers who are not that often on social media, but there is also this wave of violence among young people, and especially girls, right? You see like all these videos of young girls beating each other up, and kind of the young guys standing next to it, filming it on their phones, but not intervening. That is, again, this is a sign of a social decline, of a moral decline. What I think that a lot of what we saw in recent months and recent years were just the symptoms. And the other thing, and I'm sure we'll have more time to talk about this, what bothered me the most in the whole COVID thing. If the government would have said, this is a new situation, we are not entirely sure what we're doing. There will be mistakes, but we invite you, we want you to, let's do this together. But as you said in your monologue, right, what they ultimately did is that they made rules for others that they themselves broke. And
Let's pick this up. So much more to be discussed. After the break, I'll be joined by consultant pathologist Dr. Claire Craig to talk about the effects of the pandemic lockdowns, what they did to children and young people. You're watching The Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back once more to the Neil Oliver Show. My first guest this evening is consultant pathologist Dr. Claire Craig, who is the chair of HEART, a group of doctors who came together over shared concerns about policy and guidance recommendations relating to the COVID-19 pandemic, so called. Claire joins me now. Thank you for being here, Claire.
Thank you for having me.
As I did earlier with Ralph, reflecting on all that's happened in the last 4 years, what is your assessment, specifically in relation to what it has collectively done to children and youngsters?
Yeah, I think that is a really core question, and it's when I think what's important to understand is that we can reflect back now and we can talk endlessly about the harms that it was caused, and a lot of people are now prepared to talk about the harms that it caused. But the reality is that we knew this beforehand. We knew even more after the first lockdown because we had evidence of it, and yet still we were pushed into more lockdowns thereafter when the harm was well and truly established.
I got and get the feeling that children were always regarded as somehow invulnerable, that in some way it wasn't going to matter what was done to children, that they uniquely would absorb everything that was thrown at them and bounce back untouched.
Oh, absolutely. And if you remember back, people kept repeating the phrase that children are resilient. The WHO were the ones that were using that phrase, but it was repeated endlessly, as if, as you say, as if they were somehow not more vulnerable, which they are, but less so. And there was research and people writing about it as if it was the children's fault if they weren't resilient. They should toughen up. Nobody would say that about adults who were in a situation that was unpleasant. And children aren't resilient, not all children. And the children that suffered the most are the ones that already had all sorts of, problems in terms of kind of home support or other issues, which meant that they were never going to be resilient. And this has impacted them massively.
The very idea, that repeated statement about resilience seemed to be taken as justification for, therefore, testing children to breaking point. Just because they're resilient doesn't mean you push them to the point where they can take no more.
Well, yeah, ridiculous, isn't it? And the reality is that all that phrase really means is children keep growing. They'll still turn into adults. Well, yeah, sure, they'll still turn into adults. But, whereas teachers can step away and have a year off their work trajectory and it has no consequence when they step back in where they were. The same is not true for children. Every year of a child's development matters and you can't skip them. You can't pretend they don't.
Ralph, it seemed obvious to me that, where for an 80-year-old, 1 year of lockdown was, an 80th of their life, a year of lockdown for a 2-year-old is half a lifetime. And so for that reason, if for no other, what was done to children ought not to have happened because of the scale of it in the context of their own existences.
Well, I think another cause is, we have created a culture that is, I would argue, inherently hostile to children. If you look at the conversation around it, children are a burden, you can maybe afford children, but most people shouldn't. Then, of course, we have the entire Malthusian movement that says that the entire human race is a plague on the planet and every child is basically a sin, and it kind of, bleeds over into the quasi-religious. And I think that was also shown during the pandemic, that in many ways, right? And even before the pandemic, we don't really invest in the development, in the education, in the social development of our children. The Jesuits had a saying, give me the boy and I'll show you the man. But nowadays, apparently, we don't care about that at all, which I find is very, very frustrating.
Claire, what would you say? What do you say to those who make the argument that, for example, schools had no options, that they were just kind of handed a fait accompli, and that therefore everything that happened to children in the context of education was out of their hands somehow?
There's so much wrong with that, not least the fact that the teachers' unions were integral in pushing for lockdowns politically, particularly the one in January 2021. So if you remember, the schools actually reopened for a day, and then the unions effectively called an illegal strike because they were getting their members to submit paperwork that they had written a template for to say that the working environment wasn't safe and persuading them not to attend work. And that sort of pushed the government into saying, well, let's have another lockdown. But in reality, schools provide way more than just, the transfer of knowledge. Schools are there for lots of reasons within a society, including safeguarding children, including feeding some of the children, including the social development of the children amongst their peers, but also including the relationships with their teachers. And I find it extraordinary that teaching leaders have just completely abandoned the importance of that at a time when AI is knocking on the door saying, well, we can do transfer of knowledge. We don't need just that. You need a relationship with a teacher to motivate you to want to learn. And that's what was taken away from them, among other things.
Amongst many things that trouble me is the way in which there's a whole group who are being described as the COVID kids or the COVID cohort, as though there's already some sort of admission that there's a slice of our population that are going to carry COVID around their necks like an albatross for the rest of their lives. Oh, you're one of the COVID lot.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And one of the things I found, I was a bit nervous about coming on here because I'm a data person and some of this feels a little bit more emotive. So I had a kind of testing the water, reading around it, getting other people's opinions. And one of the things that really struck me is that people are talking about the immaturity of particular cohorts, but they're talking about it and applying it to primary school children, secondary school children, sixth formers, people at university. So, that effect of missing out on a year or two of maturation has its impact throughout that whole, progress through education.
Am I right in thinking as well that the COVID inquiry, so-called, for what it's worth, wasn't even going to look at the effect on children?
That's right.
Yeah, they took a decision.
In terms of reference, they didn't include one mention of the word child or children.
What does that say to you, Ralph? That the very body tasked with considering what happened and what might happen in the future decided, but we don't need to think about what happened to children.
No, I think it's even worse because the precise development that you describe, you talk about Great Britain, but the same is happening in Austria and Germany as well, right? They wanted to do an inquiry and now they pushed it back and back and back and back. It's probably never going to happen. Germany, the same thing. It's the issue is ignored. And I'm sure we're going to talk about this more because the government or the state simply cannot admit that they made a mistake. Right? This is what fascinates me the most. They just cannot say, I'm not even asking for an apology. I think in Denmark there was one newspaper who actually apologized. But other than that, neither the German nor the Austrian or the British government, nobody had the guts to say, we made mistakes, we are sorry. And that's a small gesture, but I think it would mean quite a lot to many people.
Absolutely. And we need to hear it from the teachers.
Agreed, yes.
As well.
Yes.
Like, why aren't the teachers saying this now? They're seeing the impacts every day. And they're not saying it, they're not defending their profession.
How, not just refreshing, but I think it would be so meaningful and so impressive for the general population if figures in authority would come forward and say, we got that wrong. That's not a cause for people being shamed and driven into, outer darkness. The population would heave a sigh of relief and say, finally somebody with the backbone to take some of this on their shoulders.
Absolutely. And of course, while that's not happened, there's a constant feeling of threat that it might happen again. And that affects the children. I mean, the children are not convinced that they're out of this.
This will not happen again. Thank you, Dr. Claire Craig. Another break's upon us already, after which I'll be joined by one of the founders of the group Us For Them, Molly Kingsley, to talk from a personal point of view about how the lockdowns had an impact on her own children, as well as everyone else's. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. My next guest this evening, Molly Kingsley, had young children of her own during the pandemic and ended up so concerned about the impact the lockdowns, amongst other things, were having on young people, she formed the group Us For Them, which campaigned for schools to reopen. And Molly joins me now. Molly, do you have any confidence that the last 4 years have taught us anything? By which I mean, do you think if the next one happens, which we're told it will, that things will be different?
I have no confidence. And in fact, I think, OK, that might be a bit of an oversimplification. I think we have learned on school closures. So obviously, as you said, where I came into this, I guess, was a campaign to get schools open. I really, really hope we will never close schools again, and I have some confidence that will be the case, at least perhaps save, you can imagine a situation that is so extreme and actually where children are genuinely so threatened that it is the right thing to close schools. We've always said that is imaginable. I don't think it was the situation we found ourselves in 2020. I do have some confidence schools won't be closed again. However, I don't have any confidence that in a similar situation where you have, millions of adults' health seen to be threatened, children perhaps threatened less so, I have no confidence that we wouldn't make the same decision to prioritise effectively adult health and well-being and safetyism over children. No, I don't.
Now, you actually put under my nose a piece relating to Sir Kevin Collins, who was the so-called catch-up czar, who the government tasked with repairing the damage. But he walked away from that position because the government was, as he found out to his horror, were not going to properly fund it. And there was a line that really struck me. All these things we could have done to send a signal about childhood, but we did nothing. We gave up. It was pathetic. That's strong.
I mean, it makes me so upset, actually, Neil, because he's absolutely right. Of course he is. But there were people, myself and colleagues included, Anne Longfield, the Children's Commissioner at the time, a handful of politicians. There were people who were screaming so loud about this for so very many years, and no one listened to us. And to hear Kevin was one of those people, I know, he did no doubt his utmost to get this recovery package pushed through. I think one of the things that Kevin talks about, which I find very powerful, and again, myself and us for them colleagues were saying at the time, is this whole language of recovery is very uncomfortable. The thought that you could close children's lives down, close their schools, take everything away from them, and somehow you'd be able to recover them. And I think, people like Liz Cole and I, one of my Us for Them co-founders, were saying right back in 2020, 2021, we shouldn't be using this language because it gives a false sense of security that we can rectify what we're doing. And unfortunately, we kept on using that language. We kept on, I believe, being gaslit by government. We had people like Gavin Williamson telling us it would be the biggest injection of energy and cash that the country had seen since 1945 to repair the damage to schools. And in the end, that proved absolutely hollow.
So am I right in thinking that what you mean by that is that even if they had embarked upon a Marshall Plan for education and children, it was still the wrong idea, that you could inflict hurt and then fix it?
Yeah. I mean, we shouldn't be thinking of children as, beings that it is OK to harm if we can fix them afterwards. That is, any parent would take issue with that. Imagine if I said that about your children. Imagine if someone said it about mine. I would, get very angry.
What is some of the up-to-date data telling us now? I mean, you've always been across the numbers. What is it saying 3-4 years later that we can understand about the consequences?
Yeah, so look, I'm going to give you a few headline figures and then I'm going to caveat it, but let me just give you a feel first. And one of the issues here is there is so much data, it is almost hard to know where to begin. Some of the most shocking data, I think, is around what we've done to the school system. So we still have, 4 years after the original school closures, 4 years this week pretty much, or coming up to it, we now have 1 in 10 pupils who are persistently absent from school. That is a marked increase on numbers before the pandemic. And, who knows if that will ever recover? It isn't so far. 1 in 5 children, so almost 2 million children across the country, are not meeting speech and language milestones. I think that's an incredibly grim figure. Speaks particularly to younger children, but of course that kind of deficit sticks with children through their whole lives. And I think the other, awful figure is we have 200 children a year now who are committing suicide. That's 4 school kids a week committing suicide. That's horrific. The caveat to that, however, Neil, is that a lot of these issues did exist before the pandemic. So, if you take a slightly longer view and look at the figures, certainly from 2000, perhaps even 2010, you will see that the rates of decline in children's physical and particularly mental well-being were already there. So this trajectory in some ways has got worse, but probably maybe not caused by the pandemic itself.
I mentioned this with Dr. Claire Craig as well, but this idea that the government were consistently saying that, well, we can't help this. We're in a situation of such danger, such significance that, well, the children are just going to have to take this and then we can move on. How do you respond to that feeling that, in a strange way, the buck seemed to stop at children, which seemed like the inversion of where the pyramid of responsibility ought to have been?
Absolutely inversion. I mean, it's something we talk about a lot, actually, in our first book, The Children's Inquiry, this idea that we have inverted the natural order, the natural morality of things. Adults are meant to protect children. As to the specific point, we had no choice. Of course they had a choice. It was a policy choice. And they knew, and we knew from April 2020, that COVID was a very discriminatory virus. That is the sad reality. It did not hugely impact the vast majority of children. It was never going to. It was very dangerous for some adults. I think that is now a given. We were never told that at the time, were we? And it might comfort senior policymakers to tell themselves, just as they told us at the time, there was no choice, but there was a choice. And you know what I would say, Neil? I would say that even were COVID a serious risk to children, you would have to take action through the lens of what was needed to protect the children. That may have meant closing some schools, may not have done. They're a way of protecting children that didn't inflict such grotesque, really, sort of pain on them. Clearly, that's what we should have aspired to do as a society, and that just never happened.
It just never happened, you're right. Molly is going to stay with me through the break and after, when we'll be joined by Kevin Courtney, who was the General Secretary of the National Education Union at the time of the pandemic. And he will argue, I think, why schools had no choice but to shut their doors. You're watching Neil Oliver on GB News. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, my next guest this evening is Kevin Courtney, who was Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union at the time of the pandemic. He says schools had no choice but to close as the virus was rife and it would have been unsafe to keep them open. Kevin joins me now. Thank you for joining us.
Pleased to be here.
The teachers' unions were amongst the most strident, weren't they, in their calls for the schools to close, even when other voices said they should open. How do you look back on that now?
Well, you make decisions in the light of the information you've got, the science that you understand at the time. So I look back on it and I think that we made the right calls. I do need to say the schools were never closed, completely closed, because they were always open to key worker children and vulnerable children at every period. But there were long periods of closure. It was always government that closed them, but we were advocating at some of those points for that partial closure.
Why so determined? When there were, you say the science, and there were other voices, including the government, saying the schools, should open generally. And yet the teachers' unions were determined otherwise.
I mean, for example, in January 2021, we were calling for schools to close. Boris Johnson on a Sunday night said the schools were open. We were saying they should close. The next day, he changed his mind and said the schools should close. He did that, I think, because of the evidence from SAGE. We looked at the SAGE minutes. That's where we were getting our position from. And SAGE was saying that if the schools were fully open, that there was no way the R rate that we used to talk about all the time, we've forgotten what it means, but the R rate would be above 1. The virus would be exponentially growing. Now, it wasn't, and this is difficult to say, it wasn't that children were particularly at risk. By January 21, we knew that the risks went up with age and with, if you had diabetes, you were at risk, etc. So SAGE was saying the schools had to be closed to protect other people, to protect the vulnerable parents, the vulnerable grandparents of the children in schools, the vulnerable parents and vulnerable grandparents of the teachers in the schools. And we thought SAGE were right. So we were going with the bulk of scientific thought on the matter.
Molly, how do you feel listening to that? You were all about opening the schools, reopening the schools, and you were looking at the same data and listening to what SAGE were saying. How do you respond to what Kevin's saying?
Look, I mean, I do have considerable sympathy, actually, for that argument, and I do understand that at the time there was a real perception that adults, perhaps all of them, perhaps a subset, were in real danger. I think there are a few things I'd say to that. I think it seems that the risk from COVID many of us might accept now that that was rather overinflated. I don't blame the teaching unions for that. I've put the blame of that squarely at the door of government. I think at the same time, the harms of school closures were either downplayed or perhaps not taken into account in the way they could have been. So you talk a lot about the SAGE papers and the R rate, and we heard so much about that, all those charts. It's a very deliberate, propagandized fear environment that we all were asked to live under. We never heard really the equivalent about the other side of the equation, the harms to children. And I don't just mean learning loss. I mean, what happens to children when you shut down childhood? Often asking them to be in environments which we sadly now know are unsafe. What happens to children when you put them in front of screens, when you move their whole lives to phones? And I think had we maybe balanced that, we may have come to a different conclusion.
Gavin, listening to that, and how do you feel now? I'm in a kind of reflective mood this evening and looking back across all of the years. What do you feel about what you must have seen has been distilled about long-term, possibly permanent harm caused to the youngest?
I mean, I've got two reactions to what Molly's just said. First, to question Molly about whether she really thinks that COVID wasn't a risk. I mean, do you mean now that we've got the vaccination, it's not a risk? Because we had two colleagues in my work who died of COVID before vaccination. They died of it, and they were not of an advanced stage, but they did have other conditions, and they died of it. It is a serious illness. But I absolutely agree that closing schools does have huge consequences, and they're not good consequences. And and it's if you're a disadvantaged child, the consequences are worse. I mean, if you're at home and you've got a nice private garden and you've got your own bedroom and you've got your own iPad, then that's very different to being in a fifth floor flat and no space whatsoever. I think the consequences have been bad for children, and our government should have been doing more to make sure the school closures should be as short as possible. Our school closures were longer than many other countries. During the pandemic, I spoke to my opposite number in the Danish teacher union. They had some school closures, but they were shorter. But the reason they were shorter, we talked this through for some time with my colleague Mary Bousted, our colleague. Their class sizes were smaller, their space standards were better, they had better ventilation in their classrooms, so it was more possible to have the school open without the virus spreading. But we were looking at the ONS statistics, which showed that when the schools were open, the level of COVID amongst the children was going up week by week by week. When the schools closed, it started to fall again. This is the hard thing. It wasn't to protect the children. It was to protect their parents, their vulnerable brother and sister, their vulnerable grandparents, and we now owe it to those kids. The government should have been investing far more in recovery, and that's not just education recovery, it's social recovery for those children.
So, look, I mean, I absolutely agree with you on the last point. I think in terms of your question about, how dangerous the virus was, I would say the sad and probably quite uncomfortable reality here is that for the vast majority of healthy people, it was not a serious threat. That is not to say there are not many adults for whom it was a very serious threat. But what we did is we asked healthy young people, including children, all of them, to bear a burden that I would say was never theirs to bear. We asked them to overcompensate for the ill health of the adult population, and I think that morally is wrong.
Kevin, is there regret? Is there regret in the industry? And I would always have preferred to think of teaching as amongst those professions that's a calling as well, that there's a pastoral care that you would expect from the people who go into that profession. And do you get any sense of there being a commitment that if something similar happens again, that the teachers and the teachers' unions would stand up to make sure that the mistakes made in the past are not repeated? Or not?
I mean, there's all sorts of things that I regret about that period. But I regret that we couldn't get the government to listen to us. There were times when we were advocating we thought that when it came to a choice, do you open pubs or schools? They opened pubs. They did Eat Out to Help Out. They kept, and schools being, it wasn't at that precise time. But if there's a choice, then I'd be in favour of schools being open, other things being closed to keep the R rate below 1. We were trying to get the government to invest in an education plan B during the pandemic to have more spaces with children and adults with them, safe checked adults, so you could have more spaces open, the R rate would be a bit lower. We were advocating, for example, there were a number of sixth form colleges that managed to make a very effective, not perfect by any means, but children were in 1 week, at home the next. And half the class was in, half the class was at home, half of them were learning online, half of them were in. And by doing that situation, they managed to, their R rate didn't go up, in that their rate of COVID growth seemed to be lower in their institutions. I think we need to look at all those mechanisms, because no teacher would want schools to be closed. You want to find the ways around it.
I feel, I mean, I'm going to run out of time, but I just feel that we're looking back on a national tragedy, a national scandal and a national disgrace, that children, the youngest, who should be, everything should be done to protect them, and yet they were made to bear the brunt of the hurt. They took the biggest hit, and I think as a society we should look back on that and find that inexcusable. But I've run out of time on that. I've run out of time on the show. Thank you to all my guests this evening. A fair and open debate, I think you would agree. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. If you're watching on television, stay tuned for Free Speech Nation. That's next. But you can catch up with more of this show online now, featuring more on the ongoing impact of COVID restrictions. OK, let's start the hour by hearing more about the COVID pandemic and the lockdown effects from Bev Turner. Bev questioned the narrative throughout. I watched Bev from the very beginning being very outspoken, and I was cheering at the screen quite often because she was saying out loud what was going on in my head. And Bev received quite the backlash for so doing. Look at this.
Why are you so sceptical about the whole thing?
99.8%, because of the facts. 99.8% survival rate from COVID-19. The average age of death is 82. This was a virus that was and remains.
Not care about this.
Exactly that.
No,
This is the language.
Of course we do. But we should always have looked after those people. We should always have looked after those people.
Yeah, we're not in that situation, though. We're not there now.
And now we're talking, just to steer it back, we're supposed to be talking about NHS workers.
We have given them the jab, but that...
Bev, how does it feel watching that? I think it's from 2021.
I just want to sort of give that woman a massive hug, because she was like desperately trying to get this information out. And I mean, I sort of find it quite funny now. You know, we're sat so far apart on the sofa, and so much of the theatre of that time is so obvious. It was so obvious to me at the time, but now it just looks comedy. It was... Just to put it into some sort of context, I was just a journalist, and I was doing a lot of the Rent-A-Gob stuff on those shows. At the time, I'd do the press review on daytime telly. And this happened, this pandemic, and I just started researching the facts. I didn't have to look very far to realise that what the vast majority of the information we were being given was emotion-led rather than data-driven. And I found myself on the sofa that day, and we were talking then about the vaccine mandates for NHS workers. And it was so obvious to me, as I said there, that you're asking healthy, young, predominantly women in that arena to take an injection with no long-term data. That was all I was ever really saying, and said, therefore, you had to balance the risk versus the benefit. And it felt like I was sat there going, the sun is in the sky, and everyone's going, no, the sun is not in the sky. It's like, the sun is in the actual sky. No, I think you'll find if you look out of the window, the sun is not in the sky. And I felt like this stranger in a strange land for so much of the time. But I was in a luxurious position in that I didn't have an obligation to a channel. And I look at that now, you know, Dermot was looking after his job, Alison's looking after a job, Matthew was, I guess, just much less easy to excuse because he was in the same position as me. And so I know they were in a difficult position. I've never received any sort of public apology from anybody, and I don't need it.
Where and why? Why do you think there was this enthusiastic cheerleading of restrictions that damaged everyone's lives, restricted everyone's lives, and people must have seen the effect they were having on everyone's children, even if they didn't have children of their own?
I think the answer to that is different for every single person and depending on the benefits therein for them. And it only really takes a convergence of benefits from a few people to suddenly the momentum for this extraordinary event in time to pick up speed until the minority are saying the sun is in the sky and the majority saying, no, I think you'll find it isn't. So I think everybody has, like I say, everybody at that time had different motivations for wanting these to continue. And, of course, a daytime show like this morning had record viewing figures. They'd never known anything like it. Everyone sat at home, you know, playing on their phones and watching telly. So, of course, it was in the interest of those media outlets. Just keep this going.
This is really all about reflecting on what happened to children. It seems to me there's been no accountability. There's been no apology. And that for the kids, for children, it's almost as though it isn't over.
You know, I think if you ask my kids, would you like there to be another lockdown? Of course they would say, yes, Mummy, we would love that, because no child particularly wants to go to school. But, of course, it isn't good for them, in the same way that sitting at home and eating Haribo for dinner isn't good for them. There's things that, as adults, we stop children from doing. And I think what I see now in my kids, so I've got a 14, 12-year-old girls, my son is now 20. The two that are still at school, the gaps in their knowledge is extraordinary. The gaps in their maths, their history, their geography, their basic stuff they just don't know. And I'm lucky. I can pay a tutor to plug those gaps should the time come at GCSEs. So many families are not in that fortunate position. And when the lockdowns happened and the schools were closed, it was almost as though it was done on the assumption that every household is happy, every family is united, the parents have got the time to sit around and make sourdough bread and play in the garden. And I remember being in that situation, and I am lucky in that my house is happy. I wasn't baking sourdough bread, but I was trying to do the work that I was doing, writing and doing some presenting still for the short period of time I was allowed to down the lens. But my children were missing out on so much. And it was so obvious to me that those children who were in houses that weren't like ours were going to be really struggling. And Great Ormond Street had a shocking statistic of head trauma going up by over 1,000% in children, just in houses where the parents had just lost it because they were obviously stressed, scared, lack of purpose, lack of money for some people.
Ralph, do you think there is a sense for children, from the children's point of view, of a part of the story that was never written for them? You know, they saw all these things happen. Some of these things happened to them. You know, their truncated education, potentially limited, opportunities and ambitions later on. But they were just left hanging. No one's ever come to children and said, sorry, or mistakes were made, or this should never have happened to you.
No, that's true, but I think we make the same mistakes in other areas as well. And the issue sometimes I feel is we live supposedly in a very data-driven period. But with COVID, like, nobody said, OK, different groups should be treated differently. Like, as you said before, there are different conditions for an 81-year-old than conditions for a 2-year-old or a 14-year-old. But the idea was, no, there must be one blanket rule, the same for everyone. Basically, everybody had to succumb to whatever government decision that was made.
What are the... sorry.
So my next guest to bring into another facet, another perspective on the situation is political commentator Nigel Nelson, who feels as a country we did what we had to do at the time. And Nigel joins me now. Thanks for joining us, Nigel.
Hi, Neil. How are you doing?
Nigel, I'm inviting guests really to reflect. Now, I think it'd be fair to say that you and I did not have, probably don't have to this day, the same understanding and the same opinions about what happened over the last several years. But looking back on it now, from where we are, and knowing what we do know, and having seen the irrefutable proof of harms done, particularly to children, what do you think and how do you assess what we did as a country?
As a country, I think that we did initially the right things, and then we started making a load of mistakes. So I don't think there was any choice but to lock down in March 2020 when we did. We should have locked down a week earlier. That would probably have saved 34,000 lives. That's the kind of estimate that comes up. Maybe even 2 weeks earlier, which would have taken us 10 days behind Italy. So at that time, there were no mitigations for this disease. We were doing something that we've done throughout history, which is lockdowns, quarantines, masking up, staying away from each other, basically.
But Nigel, on the contrary, the tactic, the strategy that had been set in place should a pandemic strike us was quite the contrary. We were always supposed to enable everyone possibly to go about their business and to prioritise the needs of the vulnerable. So, going into this wholesale locking down, putting society on hold with all of its repercussions, that was not the plan. That was snatched out of a clear blue sky.
It was, because COVID came at us out of a clear blue sky. The kind of preparations we had for pandemics were based on flu pandemics, not a COVID one. COVID was a new disease. There was certainly a certain amount of panic in government about it, but it became clear that in the initial stages, the first thing you had to do was stop people mixing, hence the lockdowns. I think you were saying earlier about whether or not people should have meekly obeyed that. I think at the time, again, we've all got to try and think back to what was going on in March 2020. I think at the time, what we were being told to do made sense. As things progressed, it began to make less sense. The rather ridiculous tier system, for instance, certainly sending old people from hospital into care homes without testing them. And you've mentioned schools. I think we may have to look again at whether it was right to close schools down as we did. But certainly in those first few weeks, I can't quite see what else the government could have done.
Let me pause you there, Nigel. Bev, how do you react to that? I mean, how representative do you think that will be of many, many people in the country who think, yeah, that was the only thing we could have done, that's what we should have done, and if it ever happens again, we should repeat it?
I mean, I'm not sure why the pandemic preparedness would be any different for COVID than coronavirus and flu. It's a respiratory virus. So the government have never explained why they ripped up that pandemic plan that was several decades actually in the making. They've never explained that. I look back on the first lockdown. Now, of course, it wasn't entirely necessary, but I'm sort of OK with that decision in March 2020. I am. I'm OK that we needed maybe a couple of weeks to work out what we were dealing with. But then it seemed to become an opportunity for people in power to capitalise upon, for everybody to capitalise upon.
What do you say to that, Nigel, that idea that, yes, OK, let's pause and think about where we actually are for a few days, a couple of weeks maybe, but then that assertion that Bev's making there, that those in power just saw an opportunity where they thought, this is great. We never thought we'd go into their homes, but they did. How else can we apply this magic new toy?
Well, I mean, then we're starting to come onto a conspiracy, and that really is sort of a kind of my question to you two, is assuming what you're saying is right, do you think it was a conspiracy on behalf of the deep state or government or whatever, or do you think it was just some absolutely awful mistake? It's got to be one or the other, and I'm not quite sure which one to answer.
I'll go first. I'll go first there, Nigel. For me, the fact that even as they were telling us what they told us about the necessity to, save the NHS, flatten the curve, don't kill Granny. Wine Time Friday prevailed in Downing Street throughout, so that there was a cohort of people who presumably had access to data that was telling them there was nothing to fear. That even as they looked on at all that happened, people not able to attend funerals, not able to visit loved ones, and all of the things that were inflicted upon children, Wine Time Friday, a maskless free-for-all, where the decisions were being made, prevailed. So I don't know about you, Bev, but I would suggest that it was all just the exploitation of an opportunity that they were too ready to grasp to take control of lives. What do you say, Bev?
I think we've seen it in the Isabel Oakeshott WhatsApps. I had that suspicion, and then thanks to the work that Isabel did in handing those over to the Daily Telegraph, we've now seen the exchanges in which, Matt Hancock was told by a friend this would be a good opportunity for you politically. And so I was like, well, there you go, bingo. And this is where the likes of us get, it's a conspiracy theory. It's not that. It's just that there were individuals who were benefiting. There were individuals for whom this was working out incredibly well, and they just didn't care about the rest of us.
So in short, Nigel, I would say that what they could have done was what they did themselves. They evidently weren't scared of anything. They went about their lives behind the door of number 10, but they were telling us to do something different. So my answer to you would be they could have just let us do what they were doing, which was pretty much carrying on as normal.
Well, OK, let's just take those 2 points you made there. The parties that went on in number 10 were absolutely irresponsible. I don't believe they would have taken place had Theresa May still been Prime Minister and not Boris Johnson. So I don't think that they had any access to data that we didn't know about to say that everything would be fine. When it comes down to Bev's point about Matt Hancock, of course it's a political opportunity for him. He's the health secretary. He's faced with a massive pandemic, the likes of which none of us had seen in our lifetimes. And that is a great opportunity for a health secretary. So I'm not surprised that there's a bit of political opportunism there, but neither of those two things, to me, add up to some kind of conspiracy that people were doing something to try and control us rather than trying to stop something killing us.
I'll stop you there, Nigel. Ralph, are Bev and I conspiracy theorists, or is Nigel naive?
I think you actually can meet in the middle, because I agree with everything that Beth said, but I would add something to this, which is we saw the same thing happening all over the West. So this was not just a Britain-specific thing. And I think one reason, I mean, it's a broad argument, but I think it's an important one, and I hope that, I'm looking forward to what you say about this, is that over the last few decades, we have broken down all the bonds that make community possible, family, associational life, all these kind of things. And we have replaced it, unintentionally maybe, with government, right? The one thing that can solve all the problems is government. And the problem is that parts of society believed it, but the people in government believed it too. So they thought, we can solve that problem. We just need more power, right? We have this magic red button, and if you give us enough power, we can push that button and everything will go away. And I think this is something, by the way, we see it still today, right? From hate speech laws to what you can post on social media, right? The government tries to regulate during the pandemic whether you can leave your home. Nowadays, they try to regulate what you are supposed to feel, whether you feel hate, whether you feel animosity, right? Which jokes can be told. And I think a reason for this is that we have replaced so many of the traditional bonds of community with reliance on the government. There were two exceptions, a few states in the United States and the Swedes.
Yeah, and I think and we felt it in the pandemic, because I just couldn't believe the government was so closely into my life. I couldn't believe the government was telling me that I couldn't see my family. And for me, my whole political outlook just did a full 180. I've never been the same since.
Nigel, do you think it does come down to whether an individual wants to be told what to do, wants that instruction from on high, that I suppose you could say makes life easier and more straightforward? And those people, more like myself perhaps, I don't want government anywhere near me. I don't even like it when politicians knock on the door canvassing for a vote. I just want them to collect the bins, put the lights on and make sure that the trucks can get to the supermarkets to put food in. Do you think it's a split between those who want to be looked after by the state and those who want the state to stay away?
No, I agree with you, Neil. I'd rather government kept away from me as well, especially this current one. But it goes back to what I was saying earlier about what we were facing back in March 2020. It seemed to make sense that when we were dealing with something that we knew absolutely nothing about, and the idea that flu and COVID are the same things is nonsense. Of course, they're both respiratory diseases, but COVID was in a whole different magnitude. So that's what I mean about the lockdown then becoming, it just seemed to make common sense to actually stay away from people, to stay indoors as much as possible. Now,
But wait a minute, Nigel. The idea that it was on a different magnitude, that was manufactured. There were many. Well, it undoubtedly was. There was that whole thing about for the first 2 weeks after you get the injection of whatever on earth was in those files, if you get clipped by a car and die, you're going to be recorded as a COVID death. You know, the number,
no,
the PCR tests, which were never fit for purpose, which the maker of the PCR tests made plain they should never have been used in the way that they were being upcycled so that people were finding so-called COVID here, there and everywhere. That those numbers were, at the very least, massaged in an upwards direction. So to call it, by an order of magnitude, a more serious condition than flu, which over the years, not too far in the past, harvested people in the tens of thousands, I don't think is legitimate.
But that's completely distorting the position. You're right that there are two different things here where COVID is recorded on the death certificate and COVID being the underlying or the main cause of death. And in 7 out of 10 of those 230,000 cases where people died, COVID was the underlying cause of death. So, your analogy of the car crash and having COVID recorded is right, but it doesn't take away from the fact that COVID was the major cause of death. Within the first 8 months of it, we had 48,000 people who died from COVID. Less than 400 had died from flu.
Bear with me, Nigel. Bev, I still don't know anyone who died of COVID. But no. I do know many people, and my children report to me, and my wider circle report to me all the time, people of all ages dropping, usually from things to do with heart or blood circulation, one way or another. And yet there are still so many people out there who look back on COVID as being especially dangerous. And I don't know personally a single victim of it.
Failed risk assessment. Listening to Nigel just reminds me how much of 2020 onwards was about a failed risk assessment. How dangerous is this? And therefore, what measures do we need to take? And we knew very early on that over 70s were mildly more likely to die of COVID than flu. Under 70 were no more likely to die of COVID than flu. That was very clear very early on. And we never took the measures to protect the people who really needed protecting over 70s from a nasty bug. It was a nasty bug that first spring, and we never allowed the freedom of the children.
It feels as if for many people, we're still where we always were.
Do you know one of the worst things? And when I look back now, I mean, this is sort of therapy in a way. I genuinely think there is a kind of collective PTSD, and I don't use that phrase lightly, that we've never really been allowed to talk about it as public now. I mean, people couldn't talk about it at the time over dinner tables. It was so controversial. And it continues to be the elephant in the room for a lot of families. One of the worst things was, for my children, was telling them we're going to break the law. I barely had a speeding ticket, and I didn't want my children to grow up thinking that you ever disobeyed a police officer or the government naively. And then I had to say to them, we are going to see Grandma, but Mummy, we're not allowed. The police might knock on the door. And I had to say to them, the police are wrong. And I never wanted to tell my children the police are wrong. And we wonder why we've got a generation now that don't care about anything, that are lawless on the streets. It didn't make sense.
I could feel you flexing with the urge to
No, there's a funny story from the 1940s during World War II, when kind of the German submarines were kind of closing in on British trade lines. And the British government back then, they made a call to the public and said, so does anybody have ideas what we can do against that? And some ideas were good, some were crackpot ideas, but the point was the government actually told the people, so if you have ideas, we're all ears. And what happened during COVID, and if you look to Martin Kuhlendorf, the Great Barrington Declaration, it was not just that they pursued a specific path. They tried to censor and suppress everybody who suggested a different path. And I think that was a major problem, because that also contributed to divisions within families. If the government would have said, like the Swedes did, I mean, they also made mistakes, but they said, we have a course, we stay the course, but we might be mistaken. Be with us, but we immediately say, like, we don't know this is new territory. But in Austria, in Germany, in the UK, the argument was made, we know exactly what we do, there is no alternative, and everybody who says there is, or there could be, or that maybe the data, changes over time, or actually has more data over time, so we should change course, right? They simply said that information is either conspiratorial, they ignored it, or they suppressed it. Again, Martin Kuhlendorf, who was a professor until recently in Harvard, he could not publish in the United States. He had to publish in Sweden, because in America it was impossible, because he was, again, a conspiratorial guy, despite his very impressive scientific academic record.
Nigel, what have we taught our children? Listening to Ralph there, that message that was hammered home, that rather than being critical thinkers, rather than asking questions, rather than reading around a subject, just trust the government. Is that the right message? Have we got a generation growing up thinking that? Or do we have a generation growing up thinking, I'll never trust authority again?
No, I think you have to make that choice. That this is an emergency. There isn't time really to start philosophizing. Sorry, I can't even get the word out. Thinking about how the government operates. I think that you go along with it, and again, was it made common sense? That you cite the situation in Sweden. The figures from the European Centre for Disease Control don't bear this out. Sweden had higher mortality than Denmark, Norway, and other Nordic countries. We don't compare Sweden with Britain, and yet that's used as an example where lockdown somehow wasn't necessary. Eventually, the Swedes did put on a load of restrictions, so more than 8 people couldn't mix, transport, stores, gyms, socially distanced. So they did actually come around to the way of thinking. And what kids will have to look back on is whether or not it was right the way that we treated this pandemic, and that's what the COVID inquiry is about, to decide how we look at the next one. Hopefully it won't come in our lifetimes.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the COVID inquiry, because the COVID inquiry took a decision that the consequences for children ought not even to be discussed. So little did they care about what had been done to children. It wasn't even worth having a conversation about it during the so-called COVID inquiry.
Well, they have been having conversations about it because it's impossible to leave children out of it. And it may well be that there was a mistake about locking down schools the way we did. It could well be that, at the time, the argument was, and the argument seemed to me perfectly reasonable at the time, if kids went to school, although they weren't at risk of getting serious illness or dying, they would bring it back home to people who might be. So that seemed to be a reasonable argument at the time. Given the damage that was caused by closing schools down, that may well be revised if we go through this again. The same way that lockdowns may be, it became perfectly clear that once people had been double jabbed, lockdowns became less necessary, and therefore the damage that lockdowns were causing versus keeping people well and not dying began to sort of merge together. So it was so as the vaccine, which is the one thing that really dealt with this pandemic, once the vaccine was on stream, everything else became less necessary.
Nigel, the product pushed as vaccines, which is as much as I'm prepared to call them, the safe and effective mantra was prepared before there was any data. That was just a preordained, preemptive decision that was taken, that was how those things were going to be described. It's demonstrably not the case. You got one adverse reaction per 800 doses, just as a baseline figure of problems. Unknown, uncounted numbers of excess deaths, people definitely dying on account of those products, long-term injuries on account of those products. They were never tested for transmissibility, and they don't stop transmission. So how can you continue to maintain faith and to say that it was the vaccines that got us out of it?
Well, OK, first of all, when it comes down to excess deaths, the ONS figure is 51 as a direct cause of the vaccine. That is considerably lower than other vaccine deaths. So it's something like 1 in a million when it comes down to the smallpox vaccine, and we gave out 150 million jabs. So it's not a bad rate. The yellow card rate for adverse reactions was no higher than any other vaccine. And yes, you're right. All these things, when I was reporting on COVID all the way through, that was one of the major concerns. And I did look into all this, talking to scientists from both sides of the argument. I came down on the side of the scientists who said, look, have the vaccine. The vaccine will do you more good. It is safe. There is a small risk of harm, but that risk is minuscule.
Bev, you heard me react to what Nigel was saying in support of those products. What say you?
Nigel is on my show every week on Britain's Newsroom. He's a very nice man. He's a lovely man. And I think that the problem is, of course, unless you really did do a huge, deep dive into all of the facts behind this, it's too easy to just accept what you've read in establishment media, newspapers, which you just take a headline from. But it's impossible unless you've had the time that we had and the commitment and the determination to really understand this topic in the detail that we do, that you would still think like that.
And Ralph, how would you're coming from another part of Europe? What's your reaction based on the experience that you had and the what you saw around you?
Well, I think one important one is, as we all remember, in many parts of the world, even with the vaccination, the lockdowns didn't stop. So if the vaccinations broke it, then one would have assumed that once you get the vaccination, life is back to normal. That didn't happen. But what really bothers me is, and we see it here as well, this is no longer a debate about medical issues. It has become a politicized, ideologized, if that's even a word, kind of debate. I mean, let's take the things at face value. Why was it so difficult to say, we have a new medical procedure, and for each individual, there will be a risk assessment. For some people, the vaccine will be a higher risk. For some people, COVID will be a higher risk. And then the doctors, the medical establishment, will decide on a case-by-case basis whether or not the vaccination makes sense. And ultimately, it would have been the quote-unquote customer, the patient who says, I choose this risk, I choose that risk. Why was that so hard? Why was it necessary to say, as you said in your monologue, no jab, no job? You want to fly to the US, you want to fly to Canada, no vaccination, you can't do it. Why was it so difficult to have to differentiate? We do this in all other medical procedures. There are people who have, allergies to penicillin. Like, we would never force them to use penicillin.
Nigel, when you look back now on the way in which the products were pushed at children, how do you feel about that? When there was no evidence at the time that they needed those medical interventions, far less that they would benefit from them. There was no evidence that it was safe so to do, by which I mean to give them those medical interventions. When you look back on that now, because this couple of hours specifically about effects on children, does that not give you pause, the way in which our youngest were treated in relation to an untested experimental gene therapy?
Yes, and there was actually a huge consideration at the time when we were doing it. The point really is that we were in the middle of an emergency, and if we had turned around, I mean, you had to go at the mainstream media. If we turned around and said, "Oh, we're not too sure the vaccine is actually safe," best not to give it until we've done this deep dive into it that you're talking about. Goodness knows how long that will take. That it was a question of making balance. I'm not medically qualified. I had to rely on people who were. So I listened to both sides of the argument. It wasn't just a matter of reading up on stuff. It was a matter of talking to a lot of different people. At the end of it, as a journalist, I came down on the side that the vaccines were beneficial. And to actually have come back and said they were unsafe, it would have been a huge story if that had been true. To say they were unsafe would have been grossly irresponsible. It would have persuaded many people not to have the vaccine who should have done. So that was the kind of balance I was taking as a journalist, not as a medical professional.
We could bat figures back and forth all night, Nigel, but I would say that I don't know a single person who regrets not having taken any of the product. But I meet people all the time who say they wish they had never gone near it because of things they've experienced themselves and because of consequences that they've witnessed in their nearest and dearest or in the general community around about them. So, and I think that is amongst the most telling bits of evidence that are out there. But why would it be pushed? Why would it be pushed towards children? The fact that it was, and the fact that it was held over their heads that they wouldn't be able to go to school, they wouldn't be able to go to gyms, they wouldn't be able to go to nightclubs. Why was it made so imperative to get that product into children who stood to benefit from it, not a jot? And the fact that that strategy unfolded, does that not make you suspicious about the rollout for everyone?
Well, the whole point was it was a rollout for everyone. The idea was
Why couldn't it just be a choice? Why couldn't it just be a choice? We've come up with this. We're not really sure what it'll do. Wish you all the best. Take it if you want. Leave it alone if you don't.
Well, everyone had that choice. I mean, you weren't forced.
Oh, come on, Nigel. People were told that they couldn't continue in their employment if they didn't take the procedure.
There were certain jobs, you're absolutely right. I was against that, by the way. I don't think that there should ever have been a mandate for a vaccine, but people did have a choice. They could have the vaccine or not have the vaccine. The question very much where we started from is, would it have been responsible to put a load of unproven theories out there that the vaccine was unsafe, as kept happening on social media?
That it was safe was an unproven theory, Nigel. That it was safe was an unproven theory. Thanks to Nigel Nelson, to Bev Turner and to Dr. Ralph Schulhammer. That's it for the Neil Oliver Show, but we'll be back next week. I'll be joined by Jason Evans, who lost both his father and his uncle in 1992 as a result of the contaminated blood scandal. He'll be telling me about his unending search for the truth of all those suffering, and I'll look forward to seeing you then.